I'd like to give a brief content warning before I start this episode. I'm going to end up discussing themes of homophobia, homophobic hate crimes, and rape. If for any reason you think that you will be severely affected by any of these topics, I encourage you to skip this episode for your own peace of mind. Hello, my name is Amber, and this is You Look Like a Badger, a podcast where I discuss queer cinema. Season 5, and we are deep in Araki season, at least halfway, not even deep. We are halfway into Gregg Araki season, and we are finally kind of discussing stuff that Araki is most known for, what kind of originated his style, I suppose. And the film I'm discussing today was seen as one of the leading films for new queer cinema. I did a bonus episode on new queer cinema, which I'll link to if you want to learn more about that. The film I'm going to be discussing today is The Living End.
Oh my god!
Oh shit.
Ken, I thought we were finished with this little phase.
I have a relapse. Sorry.
It's not the 70s anymore when being married to a bisexual was fashionable. I just can't take this anymore, Ken. I can't take this anymore.
The Living End, described as the leading example of new queer cinema, is a 1992 anarchic road movie in which John, recently diagnosed with HIV, has his life upended when Luke, a laissez-faire drifter, drags him into a life of crime and unprotected gay sex. It's a film that luxuriates in the beauty of men's bodies in an attempt to counteract the bleakness of the typical AIDS narrative. Araki is an intensely filmic director, most evident here in the queering of genre and the constant references to contemporary film culture. Still incredibly radical now, the film allows the badness of queer people to juxtapose the suffocating hostility of homophobia. This film was nominated for the Grand Jury Prize at Sundance. It has a 73% critic score on Rotten Tomatoes and a 60% audience score, and it is currently rated a 3.8 on Letterboxd. Let's get into some reviews. Let's hear some initial opinions. When I first started this segment, I was generally going for top reviews, the quippy one-liners, and I suppose the more I've been on Letterboxd, the longer I've been on Letterboxd, and the more I've done this podcast, the more I find the top reviews really, really annoying. So I do tend to have to scroll to find something interesting to talk about, because it's a lot of people trying to be funny and get likes. I'm not even resentful because I love Letterboxd. It's one of my favorite websites. But, this segment has kind of moved from me trying to find the funniest ones to find something that I can talk about before we get into the big spoilery section. So that's just some context for, I guess, this segment going forward. This first review is from Zachary, who says, "Existentialism has never been steamier nor more seething. A blistering, essential piece of 90s new queer cinema." I did read a lot of reviews where people were like, this is the kind of anger that we've been hungry for. I guess because, especially in the late 2010s, kind of in the early 2020s, there was this big push for good representation, getting gay characters into Disney movies and whatever, to the point where I think, and this has kind of been rolled back now, so my opinions have kind of changed, but this kind of opinion that really thoughtful and angry queer media couldn't really exist, because I think a lot of filmmakers wanted to appeal to the mainstream in order to get the money to even make it in the first place. The kind of money that was, I guess, afforded to indie directors in the 90s didn't really exist in the same way. I think a lot of more modern filmmakers have had to play ball with the system, and it has generally made their art worse. Well, not necessarily worse. I think there have been good examples within that. And I know this is something that I've tried to explore on this podcast. There has been like a hunger for something just messier and sexier and angrier, just not cloying to appeal to straightness or cisness. There was a hunger around then that I don't think has really gone away, for just something that feels lived in and also exciting to watch. This next review is by Jamie Rebenall, who says, "The Living End isn't just a loud scream against the bourgeoisie, it's a film that captures the anger we feel about the world at large. And it also results in something incredibly heartbreaking. Anger, rage, specific identity politics that are like identifiable and also fun to mess around with. And you will kind of notice something about Araki's films is that they tend to end in a pessimistic way." We'll go with that, in just a way that doesn't necessarily undercut the, I guess, campy hijinks that have gone before it, but to bookend them as lessons in immaturity and the fact that we can't really run away from all the terrible shit that's around us. I think that there is a desire in his movies to create a sanctuary away from the terrible world, but the terrible world is always just like right there. The ending of this film is incredibly complicated, and I intend to talk about it. Toxic love stories, they're like the bread and butter of these kinds of movies, and it's why we're here. It's why we came to watch the movie. This last review, potentially controversial, and I'm going to discuss why. So this was by St. Judas Fonda, who simply says, "Need this," and in parentheses puts psychotic top. Now, the thing about this is that I think this review is referring to Luke as the psychotic top. But if you're paying attention to the movie, Luke actually seems to be the bottom. I think what we have here is a conflation of top and dom, and then bottom and submissive. And that is simply not correct. I think what you'll find is that Luke is a psychotic power bottom. Regardless, I support your struggle, and I hope you find what you're looking for. We're going to move right into the spoiler warning. We're here, we're ready. We're going to watch, we're going to talk about the movie. We're going to be detailed, and we're gonna hit the road. We're gonna hit the road, and we're gonna commit some crimes. If you haven't seen this movie, really, I would recommend that you go watch it. Not just because it's a great film, it really is, but also because kind of the experience of watching it is significant. There's a specific feel to it, which I might not be able to convey. I also will, spoil it for you, if you don't want stuff spoiled, then go watch the film.
I thought we were through with the little Clint Eastwood routine.
Protection. It's my security blanket. What do you say we go to Washington and blow Bush's brains out?
There is a great idea. Can you at least hide that thing?
Or better yet, we can hold him at gunpoint, inject him with a syringe full of our blood. How much you want to bet they'd have the magic cure by tomorrow?
I said, put the gun away, man. At least be a little discreet with it.
Something I talked about in my introduction, and kind of where I want to start with this film, is the way that Gregg Araki queers the road movie. And I think in general, and I've also done a bonus episode on this, so I'll link that as well. Araki as a filmmaker is intensely filmic. And what I mean by that is that his movies kind of exist with the awareness that they exist as an extension and an antidote to the traditional movie. And Araki, as a avid film fan, has a deep knowledge and is aware that you probably also have a deep knowledge of what a specific kind of film is meant to look like. So this film is like plastered with iconography, with film posters, with billboards. It's a film that is aware of the image and how the image constructs a world. So there's a specific desire to situate the film as part of a genre and then morph that genre into something queer. To queer the genre. And it's not simply a case of putting gay people in a road movie. It is taking the road movie and all of its kind of masculine iconography and putting a bunch of sodomy in between it. The kind of stuff that I'm talking about is, I guess, one of the like early shots in the film is a bunch of like sandy desert landscape with Luke stood in front of it. And then you cut to the other side of the shot and you see Los Angeles. So we have this like stark contrast between the wild, the open road and the bustling city of Los Angeles. Now, Los Angeles wouldn't really be considered the place to begin a road movie. Generally, the goal of the road movie is to move more west. So you'd maybe start in the middle, like maybe Texas, and you'd move towards Los Angeles, towards like Utopia. However, that is not really the case here because we start in Los Angeles. We start in a place that is allegedly meant to be progressive. That is not the case. Another thing that you'll notice in this movie is that it's kind of dystopian. There is crime happening everywhere. Whenever we see a television, there's like violent death. When you look at the road movie specifically, it is often criminals going on the run away from like polite society into something more rugged and wild. That isn't really the case here because everyone is kind of insane and like this far away from doing a hate crime. So typically in these films, the criminals are the unique entities who are being targeted by the police or by communities. Not here, because everyone is kind of this far away from shooting their husband or getting into a fight in the street or committing a hate crime. To be lawful in this universe would actually be the aberrant quality. I read a lot about road movies for this podcast. A really good book is literally called The Road Movie Book. And I'm going to just quote from Stephen Cohan and Ina Ray Hark's introduction to that book. The road movie specifically, as they write, promotes a male escapist fantasy linking masculinity to technology and defining the road as a space that is at once resistant to, whilst ultimately contained by the responsibilities of domesticity. So often, and I watched a couple of examples, most of the time, because the road movie is kind of descendant from the Western, the two main characters will be white men. Sometimes it's just one man on his own. They are ultimately looking to explore themselves, explore America through its least traveled parts. They are using technology and they are like symbols of transgression, but in a good way. Ultimately, they come to represent a vicarious freedom that for the most part, not always, but for the most part, they aren't necessarily in danger for who it is that they are. This danger has to be kind of fabricated and put upon them. There has to be something like innately criminal about them. So if you watch a film like Vanishing Point or Easy Rider, the police, the communities, they sense a criminality about them. So it's as if they were gay men traveling on the road by themselves, or if they were people of colour, but without the actual transgression of identity politics, without the kind of baggage of actually being in danger. And they're also typically contained within like a literal car or, a motorbike in the case of Easy Rider. So they become symbols of new technology and also a transgression and a return to the natural wild man that has been contained by the suburbs and domesticity. So just to quote from that introduction again, the road movie genre has repeatedly worked first to set in opposition two contrasting myths central to American ideology, that of individualism and that of populism. And second, to use the road to imagine the nation's culture, that space between the western desert and the eastern seaboard, either as utopian fantasy of homogeneity and national coherence, or as a dystopic nightmare of social difference and reactionary politics. I don't know if I've talked about like liminal spaces on here. I've definitely written about liminality before. The American road comes to represent the in-between spaces of normal life, right? So when characters can only really exist in these spaces, there's this idea that they have separated themselves from the normal and become outlaws on purpose to like prove a point. At the same time, a lot of these characters are often searching for in quotes America, like a version of America that will accept them. If you put that in within the context of this movie, John, but especially Luke, have kind of abandoned the idea that their lives are ever going to be the same, that they're going to be especially long, that they are actually worth living. So to contrast with other examples of the road movie, there is a sense of liminality, that there is no stable sense of being. But I think especially here, the death drive, the desire to just go fuck it and collapse everything, is far more at the forefront. And I'll talk about this later. The fact that this is also a movie about HIV and AIDS definitely adds to this whole like not being quite alive but not being quite dead, not being able to exist in a straight world, but also not really having a gay world to connect with anymore because of all of your dead friends. The grief that overlays this film also has a queering effect on how far the road movie can be considered one that is arguing in favor of freedom, and whether it simply exists as a distraction from the awful shit that's going on all around you all the time. There's a second essay in that road movie book written by Shari that speaks to what I was talking about, so I'm just going to read a section from that. It's not so much death per se, but life that characters both escape and seek in the road movie. Death seems self-evident, not something necessarily either avoided or pursued in the genre. Road movies are constituted by a search for life, the characters running from death, which always threatens at either end of the road. The queering here, where death is like the forefront of the movie. Fuck it all, the end's blowing up, I blame society, everything's shit, let's just all die. We can argue the extent that this is simply a front for being kind of without a place to go, with nowhere to be, and being like a distillation of queer angst and aimlessness. I also think that death becomes a reasonable answer to the question of, if the world literally hates you for who you are at your core, where can you possibly go? Is it possible to exist outside of this liminality? In terms of representing the world, we get lots of shots of graffiti, the cityscape being defiled by, sometimes it's Luke, a lot of the time the graffiti just exists there. Sometimes it'll be on bumper stickers or billboards or written in pen. So you have stuff like fuck the world or choose death or I blame society, or the very sweet note that's written on the payphone, John plus Luke till death do us part. That this is a film that is at once anarchic but also filled with taglines, filled with like quippy statements that convey a lot in a short amount of time. I think that there is this kind of coalescence of like a punk rock aesthetic and the overwhelming influence of advertising culture, where I guess both have to convey a lot in a little amount of time, and both often speak to very immediate emotions and affect. Araki here kind of combines a culture that is inherently consumptive and one that is absolutely furious at the world but with no real power to do anything about it. The language to articulate anger has kind of been reduced to the small amount of power you have, which is like defacing a wall or the barrier in a bathroom stall. And when that doesn't work, you move on to actual murder. I'm going to talk about Luke because in preparation for this podcast, I watched 2 films. I watched The Wild One and I watched Kenneth Anger's Scorpio Rising. The significance here is that both kind of deal with, one of them intentionally deals with, the other accidentally deals with, the homoeroticism of the biker. The leather jacket, the cigarette hanging out the mouth, the smirk, the scowl, the disaffected attitude, the hunger for violence, the middle finger to authority. Luke kind of is a concentration of all of those things. He has his leather jacket and his jeans, he's got his sunglasses, he has a cigarette hanging out of his mouth that he doesn't light, he's got a crucifix necklace, and he spends most of the movie hitchhiking, at least in the beginning, because he doesn't belong anywhere. And I think I'll get onto this later, but Luke kind of represents a concentrated erotic anarchy where John, in contrast, does not seem like the kind of person who would just go on this crime-free road trip on his own. He has to be pushed by Luke. Luke comes to represent all of the anger and sexual energy that John cannot seem to muster as his body kind of succumbs to his illness. He's got like whiskey. Luke's got whiskey in his pocket. He's got like one earring. It's beautiful. He has a dark blue hanky in his left pocket. So I looked up the hanky code, and the navy blue in the left pocket is the code for top. I still maintain that he isn't a top. Like, literally, he is the one who gets fucked in the movie. What he is conveying is that he is large, in charge, and he's gonna run you down. He's gonna steal your car, he's gonna shoot you in the face, because he doesn't give a fuck anymore. All he cares about is sex and violence. Isn't that what we all care about at the end of the day? Isn't he like a representation of who we wish we were? The movie is on board for the fantasy up to a point. To the point where, and again, I'll talk about this later, AIDS as an illness becomes more tangible, more real, and the fantasy of vicarious violence no longer reads as a reasonable reaction to what is happening. In contrast, John's a big old film nerd. He lives a far more sensible life, and despite this, he has still contracted HIV. So his house is surrounded by film memorabilia. He's got posters of Godard and Warhol's films. He's got a giant Godzilla blow-up doll in his living room. He's at one point holding a magazine that literally just says Derek Jarman on the back. Araki is signaling to you that this is a film about films, and also this man is a huge fucking nerd. That his job, as he states it, he is paid 25 cents a word to rip other people's work to shreds. Sly little dig at critics there. I think that this contrast is surprisingly quite normal for the road movie. There is generally a more wild one and one that is more sensible. Sometimes you'll get a movie like Two Lane Blacktop where both of the men are kind of nothing characters, like they only care about the cars and the road and nothing else. But generally there is a split, and that split is meant to, I guess, represent the two kinds of man that you can be, and tends to highlight why there is such a separation between the two. As the BFI South Bank program notes for this film state, this film, I guess, kind of existed around what would be called a fin de siècle necro-romanticism, existing as a film that is a little bit too self-consciously reckoning with the fact that culture is about to implode. I have, for some reason, been reading a lot about Generation X. That kind of research has kind of seeped into here. But there was this kind of idea, especially around this period of time, that just before Y2K, and amongst like a bunch of events that caused a kind of malaise around the system, there was like an explosion of postmodernism where culture is collapsing, and we are just kind of dancing in the wreckage of that. And Araki's work, especially around this period of time, especially in the Teen Apocalypse trilogy, there's this idea that these movies exist at the end of the world. And as a result, they have to convey this kind of mixture of absolute joyful nihilism and also severe grief and the violence that, I guess, follows that kind of intense expression. Moving on from the more implicit queering of the genre, there is an intense, explicit queerness within the film where there aren't really straight people here. There are like capital S straight people and I guess the gay psychopaths that surround them. There aren't really like successful normative heterosexuals. There are people, I guess, pretending to be happy. And then there are like pockets of gay people absolutely wrecking shop, causing the most damage, doing massive amounts to, I guess, upend the structures. I think the clearest example would be what I've referred to in the script as Leslie, Thelma and Louise. So, like Thelma and Louise. They're called Daisy and Fern. They're introduced quite early, I think, to kind of get ahead of the comparisons to Thelma and Louise, which will have come out, I think, like a year before this came out. They pick up Luke at the side of the road, and when they point a gun at him and threaten to shoot him, he isn't fazed. He's too cool for school, and he ends up just stealing their car. We don't have gay-lesbian solidarity in this movie. Everyone's quite antagonistic towards everyone else. That kind of antagonism, that lawlessness, it does end up seeping into the main relationship. But it's not entirely surprising that there is not a cogent sense of the romantic, because at every turn, people are trying to kill them. If there aren't like gay bashers or people just being homophobic at them, it's like literal police. Luke commits so much crime in this movie. I don't think that he actually kills anyone on screen, but he does cause a lot of harm, and he does end up on several occasions just covered in blood. The symbolism of that is quite significant because of how HIV can be contracted. The fact that Luke is quite intent in covering himself in blood speaks to the suicidality of him. So if you contrast it with John, who is very much positioned as the safer one, the one who could more easily assimilate, Luke comes to, I guess, represent what it looks like to be a bad queer who is not being safe, who is deliberately having unprotected sex and getting as close to other people's blood as possible at a time where both of those factors are incredibly taboo and will only cause further alienation. There's this kind of assertion that it does not matter if you are a good queer, right? You will be subject to violent homophobia regardless. You can contrast it to something like Vanishing Point, which I mentioned earlier. So there's a very famous scene in Vanishing Point where the main character in that movie, he picks up two gay men who have specifically, they have a sign on the back of their broken down car that says just married, and they are what we would describe as effeminate men. And when they pull a gun on him to carjack him, he effortlessly beats them up and kicks them out of his car. And this is meant to be seen as both a moment of comedy and a moment of triumph, right? A normative movie seeks to point out the otherness of gay identity. What this film argues in favour of, I guess, is embracing that otherness, acknowledging the pain of being constantly rejected and subject to violence, and refusing to make that violence a mockery, or at least refusing to let the victims of it be the butt of the joke. I think the first set of gay bashers in this film, they're literally wearing drugstore cowboy and Sex Lies and Videotape like fan t-shirts. So both of those are films. The gay bashers in this movie are avid film fans, at least avid enough to have watched both of these movies and also acquired the t-shirts for them. So there is a kind of ridiculousness to committing a kind of hate crime to reaffirm one's masculinity. It's in direct opposition to a film like Vanishing Point, where the lone cowboy insert who is traveling at a certain speed to try and get somewhere within a certain amount of time and effortlessly evading the police and reaffirming his masculinity by not giving a fuck. The fact that he violently assaults two gay men should undercut all that, but it doesn't. It's specifically there to reaffirm the heterosexuality of a character who is not currently having straight sex in front of you. So many movies about masculinity exist to disavow queerness, to uncouple it, and to present any kind of aberration of a normative sexuality as something that can be rightfully discarded and abused, and that you can laugh at this, and that's okay. And I think Araki's bold statement that, in fact, masculinity has always been really fucking queer, and that hateful violence is more an expression of insecure people who are merely ancillary to the, I guess, centralized queerness of people who are made to think about their sexualities all the time, specifically because they are presented as other, as outside of normative society. By virtue of queering one's identity, by having a bunch of gay sex and covering yourself in blood and committing a bunch of crimes, there is a specific kind of centrality to that. There is a kind of main characterness of that. The making yourself different to the normies would, in any other situation, make you a main character, except when it comes to the masculine genres, in which there has to be a limit to the transgression of your character, and that limit is typically how often you think about naked, sweaty men. Araki does not allow this. You must be thinking about them. You must be thinking about their naked, sweaty bodies. It is, in fact, essential that you think about this in order to understand the appeal of the genre in the first place. Like, why do people watch sexy biker movies and men doing tough man things, other than to think about their sexy bodies while they're writhing around each other? That kind of sublimated sexuality can only be foregrounded in like a modern interpretation of a genre piece. Why would you even bother to reimagine a genre without gay people? Why would you even bother to do that?
Journal entry for April 13th. Day like any other. The first day of the rest of my life. Had Hostess Ho-Hos for breakfast. Stopped off at Aaron's and bought the new Dead Can Dance CD. Got the results from my first AIDS test.
Positive. Sorry.
Now let me explain what this means. The test only verifies that you have the antibodies to the virus. And as you're probably aware, many people live perfectly healthy, normal lives for years and years. So by no means should you consider this a death sentence. And no doubt you've heard of so-called safe sex, which as a member of a high-risk group, you ought to be practicing anyway.
Now I just have no idea what the fuck I'm gonna do.
I'm going to begin this next section with a quote from Gregg Araki in an interview he gave in Bright Lights Film Journal. I remember in the late 80s, early 90s, there was just so much death in the air. AIDS is still a big problem, but at the time, it was this kind of unstoppable holocaust. And this is the context with which The Living End comes to be. It's a film that is directly responding to the current moment, that being the AIDS epidemic and the complete implicit violence of not dealing with it in a sufficient way, and the mass death that occurred as a result of it. At the same time, it's very much a movie that is in response to what an AIDS movie should look and move like. I'm going to quote an article from the Face of AIDS film archive, written by Emma Gray Month, who says, in the 1980s, typical media representations of AIDS in the US were under the influence of the political clout of the religious right and their conservative ideas about sex and LGBT issues. The early story of AIDS was all about family values, homophobia, stereotyping, and fear of the other. I also want to quote an essay by Susan Sontag, of all people. So she wrote an essay called AIDS and its Metaphors, and I think that would also be helpful to kind of contextualize what this film is responding to specifically. AIDS is the favourite concern of those who translate their political agenda into questions of group psychology, of national self-esteem and self-confidence. Although these specialists in ugly feelings insist that AIDS is a punishment for deviant sex, what moves them is not just or even principally homophobia. Even more important is the utility of AIDS in pursuing one of the main activities of the so-called neoconservatives, a culture kampf against all that is called, for short and inaccurately, the 1960s. As I said, I have been researching Generation X for other reasons, specifically an essay I was writing about Generation X and the sex comedy. And from what I've read, basically a lot of the conservatism in the 80s and going into the 90s was a specific response to the political upheaval that the 60s and 70s brought about. And so there was a clamping down of deviancy, I suppose is the word, and an attempt to return everything to safe and normal. It does kind of feel like we're going through a similar period, and I think being exacerbated by a literal illness that is capable of causing mass death if not dealt with, really it provided opportunity to push for specific values like family values and return to a familiarity that moves the blame away from the structural. There's a specific conversation in the film between John and Darcy where Darcy basically asks John if he was careful. So already we're setting up that contracting HIV, that dying of AIDS is very much a personal responsibility, that illness itself can be manipulated into propaganda against gay people, and also a way of shifting responsibility from the government, from people in power, from protecting marginalised people from harm, from structural abuse and oppression. And the film very much sets up this binary between personal responsibility and cultural apathy. So there is this idea that society doesn't care about you, but you have to really care about yourself. And as a result, your country, how you're affecting other people. Are you infecting other people? Are you the danger, basically? I'm going to end up quoting quite a bit here because there's been a lot of really good and interesting writing about this film and basically just AIDS media in general. Roger Hallas has this book called Reframing Bodies, AIDS, Bearing Witness, and the Queer Moving Image. I wanted to read a bit from that to basically talk about how queer artists were expected to respond to a cultural movement and how they ended up responding to it. Queer media makers demonstrated a distinct suspicion towards the ostensible transparency of realist forms in mainstream media, particularly those of news broadcasts and television documentaries, which arguably played the most important role in shaping the dominant representation of AIDS. As a result, queer media makers constructed a testimonial address to the viewer that interrupted particular media conventions, genres, and dynamics. Yet each of them had to negotiate between the imperative to bear witness as directly as possible and the need to interfere with the discursive structures of the kind of mass-mediated representation that functioned to silence, objectify, or marginalize through its ideology of realist transparency. If you're enjoying this season of my podcast, you will have seen Gregg Araki's movies. I have kind of talked about the tension of realism and whether that's a valuable thing to want from a filmmaker, whether it's fair to call his films anti-realism or in conflict with realism when it's a way of, I guess, mediating an uncertain present moment. His films around this period, particularly around this period, were very much heightened, very much in a tell, show, yell at the camera, loud music, loud colours, sex as language, as opposed to monologues and good acting and decent homegrown family values. This film is framed as an irresponsible movie and directly confronts you with the extent that trying to appeal to the humanity of a heterosexual audience who may be indifferent to your pain and suffering is a dead end, and instead queerness should be queered from society, because that is happening regardless whether you permit it or not. That's what's happening. And I think this inherent distrust of the natural, of the realistic, it speaks to the rage that I guess permeates the films of Araki, because I'm not sure that necessarily all of his films could be read as inherently filled with rage. I think this one is probably the most transparently angry. I do think all of them have this wave of there is something wrong, there's nothing I can do to change it, and I can't change my attitude towards it, so I guess this is just my life. Of feeling stuck and unrepresented and kind of incapable of transcending the kind of apocalyptic worldview when it is so clear when you look around you that the transgressive world is not only dying but is being actively killed off for the sake of pretending that America is a country where things are safe and normal. The other way that the film very deliberately diverts from traditional narratives about AIDS is that it is incredibly concerned with sex. You wouldn't think this would be an odd thing, except very often there is this heterosexual gaze looming down on stories about AIDS, because in order to appeal to the most amount of people, you have to be as safe as possible. And if you show people, I guess, deliberately flouting the rules of safe sex and don't get someone else's blood in your mouth, there is this idea that you're glorifying sex and violence, which is both innate to American culture and has to be disavowed once again to maintain this image of safe and normal. The way that Araki is obsessed with sex as a means of connection, as a means of expressing desire, but also expressing suicidality, absolutely fascinating, especially when it is tied up with infection, with death and disease, stuff that you probably wouldn't consider to be erotic or sexy, but because it is tied up with this bad boy image with beautiful shirtless men who love each other's bodies and want to fuck each other. On occasion, it does kind of feel like Luke specifically pursues John because he is HIV positive and not in spite of it. Like I said, there is this thread of death and suicidality running through Luke's character, specifically because he seems to be the expression of fuck it all, we're all gonna die anyway. In spite of these transgressions, the film is not really immune to the crushing reality of an illness that basically kills your immune system. So as the road trip goes on, John gets more and more ill and decides that he just wants to go home. His adventure has not been as spiritually fulfilling as maybe he wanted it to be, and he is very angry that he's unable to go back to a sense of normal. Luke, on the other hand, is similarly angry, but it's more at the idea that they can only ever exist in opposition to one another, that John had the opportunity to appear normal and Luke was literally never given that chance. He's presented as someone who has always been on the outskirts and is annoyed at John, at his desire to assimilate. He compares it to repeatedly banging his head against a wall. There's this realization that there is nowhere to go and nowhere to be, and there's no cure, and that death is coming. What do you do with all this anger? You either let it die with you, or you get out of your system. And if you ask me, I think that's what the ending of the film kind of represents. I think I'm going to talk about the ending more in the next section. But before I move on to that, I wanted to talk about the man who this film is actually dedicated to. The dedication right at the end of this film, I'll just read it out. Dedicated to Craig Lee, 1954 to 1991, and the hundreds of thousands who've died and the hundreds of thousands more who will die because of a big White House full of Republican fuckheads. Once again, incredibly angry, incredibly political, incredibly pointed. So Craig Lee was in this film. He plays the married man who Luke spanks with a tennis racket and who's murdered by his wife. It's a lot as a scene, it's a lot. But Craig Lee specifically was a seminal figure in the LA punk scene who passed away prior to the film's release and was the first person that Araki personally knew who died of AIDS. I did find some stuff about the benefit concert that was put on in order to help him with medical bills when I was researching about him, because I didn't really know that much about him. There isn't a ton about him online, but there is a specific page. It's called the Theoretical Archives, and I will link it below, where there are various pages. I think it's people specifically a part of this scene, about part of the Los Angeles punk scene. It's a page dedicated to him by people who knew him. I'm going to end this section with 2 segments on this page. So the first one was kind of an obituary written by 3 people who knew him. So this was written on the 18th of October 1991 by Brendan Mullen, Stuart Timmons, and Gazer X. One of the most wonderful and sharpest thorns in the rose garden of underground culture. Writer, critic, producer, and musician, Craig roamed the outer extremities of the local alternative scene. Most people remember his influence on Los Angeles music during the early days of the punk rock movement. He was a controversial music editor for 2 years during a crucial period of its evolution. He was also a music reviewer for the LA Times and a frequent contributor to LA Style, The Advocate, and various fanzines. Though he was a rock critic, he enjoyed reviewing films, plays, demonstrations, and exotic locales. Recently, he began writing fiction. 3 of his stories will be published in gay men's anthologies. His unshakably opinionated views were impish, catty, incendiary. Craig also produced Rock of AIDS, the first benefit in which local rock musicians donated their services for an AIDS organization. In 1987, he produced Music for Life, which took AIDS education to Latino communities around MacArthur Park. He was the glaring guitarist for Catholic Discipline. He was also in other bands, including The Boneheads, The Bags, Funhouse, Suave Bowler, and most recently, Alama. He was also the Svengali behind Lotus Lame and the Lame Flames, a bizarre bondage bikini-clad group fronted by a moonlighting bank manager. Craig wrote all the tunes in their show, a smash on the pre-club fuck underground party circuit. This next section I'm going to read is from Craig Lee himself in an unfinished letter. I'm just going to read the whole thing. I've just finished watching 7 hours of videotape from my benefit concert. It looks like a show from my dreams. It's too bad this dream had to come from a nightmare, but the nightmare will stop as soon as people stop this disease. I've never wanted to hide from the truth, even when it's less than pleasant. I had big problems letting people know I had AIDS. I was scared of how some people would react when I turned positive 5 years ago. I didn't mean to be a coward, but I've let the A word become as much of a stigma for me as for most people, and we need to break that stigma down. It's only a stigma if you let it be one. Obviously, the many people who helped me out that night were not afraid to get close to the demon. If we're going to fight this thing, we have to be truthful about what it is and who the real enemies are. Part of the reason I'm such a critical person is that I've always had a hard time accepting love and encouragement from others. Watching that video, I felt there was a lot of love on that stage, and if that power could heal me, I'd be out of my bed dancing with Vaginal Cream Davis to Frank's songs. I too have a lust for life, but I'm not afraid, and receiving that concern will make whatever passes before me a lot easier. Love means never having to say you're sorry, so I'm not going to apologise for whatever I've done. But I hope people can put together another show like this, not because someone's dying, but because they are happy to be alive and vital. Treasure life. Don't abuse your bodies and souls. Don't do anything to stop it. And the next time you see some racy girl screaming her lungs out while playing 3 chords on an out-of-tune guitar, know that I'll be there in spirit, cheering her on. Thanks for all the beautiful noise.
I want to ask you something.
Right now?
If you had to choose, Which would you rather die for? Sex? Or love?
What are you talking about?
No, come on, I'm curious.
You're drunk. Out of your fucking mind is more like it. True. So, do you mind if we, continue this discussion a little bit later? I'm starting to lose my heart on. I really hate guys who talk during sex. Did I ever mention that?
This last section is going to be focused on the explicit ties between sex and death in this movie. So I'm kind of just pulling together everything that we've talked about so far. So the road movie, I talked about liminality and kind of a nowhere space, and how many of these movies end with like extreme acts of violence. And I also talked about the AIDS movie, which is also a genre that tends to end in death. They tend to have different approaches to it. I think the AIDS movie is more interested in evoking your pity, whereas the road movie is trying to convey a sense of space and a feeling of listlessness, and a sense that America is somewhere to find, as opposed to just a massive nowhere that you can ride across forever. The Living End is very much coalescing both of these elements, and the fact that Luke is essentially meant to represent John's repressed sexual desire, repressed suicidality in the wake of really life-changing news, it all makes sense for what the movie's going for. And I think this idea that people who have been out of the closet for a long time, there is a presumption that that process has unmasked all of your shame, and you've got it out of your system now. You can finally be who you want to be. And something like the AIDS epidemic really calls into question the extent that that is true, that the world is, I guess, ready for identities that are maybe hazardous. And what does it mean to have a hazardous sexuality? How do you process shame amongst that? In the early scenes in the movie, John is getting repeatedly sexually harassed over the phone. And this is alongside Luke is coming in and out of his life. We get the sense that, like, I guess, the stalker caller on the other side of the phone, the call is coming from inside the house. And I suppose the tension of this is that personal responsibility versus cultural apathy that I was talking about earlier. And the way that Araki balances this is there is a literal spate of constant violence all the time, much of which is homophobic. Still, I think Araki is incredibly invested in towing this line between extreme upsetting violence and beautiful men pouring whiskey all over each other and having shower sex, doing semi-dangerous sexual acts like roadhead. Luke essentially representing the antithesis of safe sex, where the build-up towards orgasm, I guess, is the only time when John is not thinking about the fact that he's going to die. And this orgasm, which I think the film in general is building to, I think that's how we can interpret the ending there, as one big orgasm. This combination of sex and violence, sexual violence, I think, is the best way that we interpret the ending. And a suicide attempt in the midst of it is the epitome of anti-safe sex. We are aiming for the most irresponsible portrayal of gay men, of sex, of illness that is possible. But I think he's also able to offset the more edgelord tendencies by being incredibly sincere, not just like sensual, but incredibly like intimate in the way that he shoots both of these actors, especially during the sex scenes. One of my favorite things, I talked about it before on this podcast, is when a sex scene becomes its own kind of conversation, where the way two characters are fucking conveys something to the audience about these two characters. There is an explicit conversation about whether or not, I think it's Luke asks John whether he wants to die from sex or die from love. it's such it's such like a pointed conversation. When I talk about this being like a filmic experience, the dialogue is so deliberately meant to convey meaning. It is not meant to, I guess, convey a realistic conversation. When the ending happens, and it is an upsetting ending that is preceded by Luke self-harming, he cuts his wrist open and tries to look at his own blood. And I guess all of this ends up with the pretty upsetting, I interpret it as a rape scene. I can also understand how it could be the end point of the kinky dynamic that has been playing out throughout the movie, where John has his hands bound behind his back and Luke is fucking him whilst he holds a gun in his own mouth. The fact that he shoots the gun and there's no bullet, it conveys a failure. If I am to use like the orgasm metaphor once again, it comes across as a false start. I also think that it really does highlight that it feels more like a scene, a performance, as opposed to a real act of sexual violence that is meant to hold a lot of weight. That these two characters exist for each other to act out their anger in a world that is not letting them be angry, and I guess to exist as a form of catharsis for one another. The ending of the film is really upsetting. There are a couple of films that we're going to cover that have upsetting endings. The Doom Generation, I'm honestly quite nervous to rewatch that because the ending of that film really fucked me up last time. But I think Araki is very interested in the tension between something beautiful, something that is worthy of our desire, and also something that is going to completely fuck us up and change our lives forever, which, to bring everything back round, is what the purpose, in my opinion, of a movie even really is. Like, you want to go on this big journey where everything is overturned and you come out at the end of it completely different, and that process has this element of catharsis to it for the audience, not just for the characters. Let's ask the question, does this film look like a badger? No, I don't think so. Araki's self-conscious filmmaking can be abrasive at times, but there was, and somewhat still is, a hunger for the queering of conventional genres to highlight their typically conservative slant, whilst also not denying their relevance in the present moment. There is a sparseness to the film that can at times read as apocalyptic as opposed to amateur, which I think is in line with Araki's filmography in general. And it feels as though the world has abandoned the homosexuals to get on without any assistance from those in power, and is very angry at the lack of culpability surrounding this process of abandonment. Let's do some recommendations, and then I'll send you on your way. I'm going to start with a film called Buddies. This is directed by Arthur J. Bresson Jr. and was the first US movie about AIDS. I love this movie. I cry every time that I watch it. It's specifically about generational and ideological conflict and what responsibility the gay community has to one another in times of tragedy. I think that this is one of the most deeply felt movies of all time, and it's a shame that it did not seem to set the tone for the genre. I don't think most of the HIV and AIDS movies after this really looked anything like it. I'm gonna shift gears. I'm gonna give a genre recommendation. If you're looking for another gay road trip, I would recommend Butterfly Kiss. This film is starring Amanda Plummer. You might remember her from Pulp Fiction. She plays a character who is a little bit unhinged. She ends up going on a crime spree, murdering a bunch of people, and she drags along a passive petrol station worker to journey across the country, the north of England specifically, looking for a woman named Judith. And the whole film reads as a search for redemption. And it's a very, very British film. It speaks to me in a lot of ways. But also, I don't feel like enough people have even seen it. So yeah, definitely watch that one. This last one, incredibly specific, but actually I think is probably the most important one on here. It's about an hour long. It's called The Gay Man's Guide to Safer Sex. Once again, incredibly British, but is one of the most instructional sex education videos I've ever seen. It is explicit and it is sensual and it is factual. And in my opinion, it is what sex education should look like. Not hiding behind innuendo, not depriving people of information, not overly sterile, just engaging with sex as it exists and showing people how to actually do things. I think some parts of it are a little bit dated. I'm not sure if all of the information in it is correct, but yeah, one of the best things I've ever seen, in my opinion. We're done. We did it. It's the end. Thank you very much for listening. I'm going to be back in August with the next main episode. If you'd like to stay updated, please make sure to follow me on Twitter at LikeABadgePod. Follow me on Spotify and YouTube for full episodes and teasers. If you would like to read some of my writing, you can visit ambercomewalk.com. I recently wrote an essay on, I think I mentioned it earlier, the late 80s, early 90s sex comedy, and specifically Generation X's relationship to this kind of film. I'm currently, and hopefully this will be done by the time this episode comes out, I'm currently writing about Rosemary's Baby. It's gonna be a big boy. It's gonna be a big one. I'm hoping it's gonna be finished by the time this episode comes out. I will link to everything in the description. All of my sources are also in the description. I hope you enjoy this episode, and I will speak to you next time. Bye!